Hey folks, this is a quick overview of the social contract tradition in modern political thought, which we typically look at in terms of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and that's what we're reading in this class. It's interesting that those three authors there, writing in a sort of short period of time on somewhat similar topics, play an outsized role in this course and in contemporary understandings of the history of political thought. Um, but I think it's reasonable to a certain degree, in part because I think that the ideas of the social contract really do resonate with a lot of our modern and contemporary commitments to what life is and what legitimate government is, and it's essential to a lot of more contemporary political thought, and that's why I put Rawls down here, who is also famously a social contract theorist, though we're not going to deal with him until later in this course. So Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Here are these dudes, and I think, and I've got Rawls up in the corner. Um, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Um, I added some sunscreen up here in the corner, just because it's hard to imagine three paler old white men. Although Rousseau is certainly a handsome gent there. Um, deciding what human nature is, deciding what sacrifices in terms of liberty and rights are reasonable in order to gain certain advantages through um, the voluntary creation of a collective government. And so, again, right, the idea of who is willing to sacrifice what might have to do a lot with the position you see yourself as occupying in society. And so that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. What were the blind spots about human nature, about hierarchy, about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, that these three individuals may have had. And again, I also throw in here, and Glaucon, right? Because all the way back in the Republic, a lot of you guys noticed and seemed attracted to the idea that, before he or along with the Ring of Gyges, in book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon basically presents this idea of, hey, isn't justice just what everyone agrees to individually in order to make their lives better? I won't kill you, you won't kill me. I won't steal from you, you won't steal from me, and we'll both be happier. In a sense, like when we get to Hobbes, that's basically what we're doing here. Except Hobbes has adds on some sort of bonuses that say, and the only way that that works is if we have this kind of government, make this kind of contract. Um, so, all right, the social contract. What ideas do they share, and perhaps what ideas do we think are essential to modern political thought? If we think that the social contract is the heart of modern political thought in at least the Western canon. Maybe these are some essential things. They don't agree on everything. Hobbes likes monarchy. Locke likes a democratic republic. In some ways they're very opposite in their thinking, but there are some ideas that unify them. So some shared ideas. Individuals are the primary actors. Yes, states are essential also, but states only arise through the coordinated actions and choices of individuals. And that's backwards to the way the ancients thought about things, because they would say to you, what the hell is an individual? What is a person? What is a rational choosing person outside of a society, outside of a social and political context? That doesn't exist. That's a fiction. That's a unicorn. You only can make choices as an individual if you are born and raised and held within a political community. That's Plato and Aristotle. Socrates doesn't in the Crito go off and leave his community, because there is no life outside of the community. Aristotle very explicitly starts from the idea of the community first, and from the community we then explore the individual and human nature within that community. But in the ancients, the community was given. In a lot of this social contract modern theory, we start with the individual as an isolated entity, a rational brain in a, floating around, that then makes choices that create the social entity, the society, or the government. And so that's that flip there in perspective that is essential to modern thought. Leads us in a lot of different ways, right? Leads us in a lot of different ways. So number two here is this idea that a legitimate or just government, one that should not be overthrown, derives from the consent of the governed, right? Even in terms of Hobbes, who thinks we should have an absolute monarchy, says based on the consent of the governed. Now, his idea of consent is one that's a little odd to us, but we'll get to that in the Hobbes lecture. Also, right, essential to this idea of a social contract that everyone rationally assents to, consents to, engages in, is three here, the idea that life outside government is categorically worse than life under a just government, right? So if everyone living under a just government is happier and better off and prefers that to life in the state of nature, or if not the state of nature, life without government, right? That's a distinction that's going to come up a little bit with Rousseau. But yeah, right. Having a just government, a legitimate government, always for everyone better than having no government. Well, that is the kind of trick that is essential to social contract theory. Because if something is rational for 100% of the people, then we can assume that consent has been given. You're a rational creature. You're always going to choose life over death, more over less, whatever it is. There are certain things that these thinkers believe everyone who's in their right mind would choose, and if you wouldn't choose that, then you're insane, or you are not a rational creature, and you can be excluded from the contract. But everyone who is a functional human adult is going to agree to these things, and therefore we can just skip any literal consent in most cases and go to a point where we can assume consent if the institutions are built properly, if they are ones that would be consented to by everyone. And that's an interesting switch, right? Because in all of these theories, we're all often saying, well, I never agreed to anything, right? What are you talking about? Social contract. I never signed anything. I never, put my signature on the line for I agree to this Constitution. Did you ever do that with the U.S. Constitution? You ever sign up and say, yeah, I'm into this collective agreement? No, right? It's assumed that by living here that you do, and they come up with justifications, theoretical justifications for why that's not sleight of hand. That's in fact an enactment of your will. And the flip side of that is, of course, that illegitimate or unjust government is worse than no government. That's when it is no longer in your interest, and you would object to it, overthrow it, rebel against it. And so, that's going to differ. What point you hit that with is going to differ for the different theorists based on what they think is the point of government, and what it's doing, what it's adding to our lives. But one of the things that's interesting there is that, we are not, again, talking about the good life like with the ancients. We're talking about people want to be alive and to make choices and to have a bunch of stuff. They want safety, they want security, they want liberty, and they want stuff. And those are, a little bit of different goals from what Plato and Aristotle, had for the public. They wanted a noble or a virtuous public. And for the most part, a little bit less so with Rousseau, but we're talking about, again, what people would want, their basic desires, their natural desires, what people naturally want. And again, right, Plato was like, we need to curb those natural desires. That's the whole point of the Republic, is to get people in line so that their natural desires can be contorted into something that works better, that's nobler, that's purer, more virtuous. Again, the social contract theorists in the modern tradition are less concerned with that, though it is notable that that Rousseau does deviate a little bit in his belief that virtue needs to be cultivated. They all talk about virtue to some extent, but it plays a less central role in, say, Hobbes and Locke than in Rousseau, and definitely than in the ancients. So let's keep rolling here. So I've got this little chart here that might be helpful to you guys, and I don't know that I'll go through it all. But you can see here I have the three theorists, and then I have these sort of categories. What is human nature like? What is their science of human nature? Based on that human nature, what do they think the state of nature is? As in, without any kind of government or society controlling the individual, how would a bunch of individuals interact based on their human nature? In that state of nature, what is it that drives people to leave the state of nature where they are completely in a full state of liberty, where they make all of their own choices and have all of the responsibility for their own welfare? What leads them to join a government where they give power over to a collective body? What are the things that push them to do that? And then, right, the flip side of that is when you get into a legitimate government, what is it that you've gained? What's so great about this government? And then flip it again, right? What is it that would break the contract, that would say that this government was no longer legitimate and doesn't bind you anymore? What has to be lost before you say, this is no good, I'd rather be back in a state of nature? So, for Hobbes, you can see, right, people are selfish, they're avaricious, they want stuff, they want power, they're vainglorious. We'll talk about that in the Hobbes slide, but essentially it means that they overestimate their abilities. They're afraid of each other because I'm power hungry and I would, club you over the head to take your stuff, and I assume you would do the same to me. And so, we're both, I'll get you before you get me. That's a terrible way to live. Again, right? That's back to Glaucon. And they're rational. So in the face of the same situations, they all choose the same thing. And what is the sum result of all of these parts of human nature? Well, it's that life is going to be in the state of nature, nasty, brutish, and short. It's going to be a constant, never resolved state of war. Terrible, the worst thing that you can imagine, right? Is essentially what Hobbes is saying. Because of human nature, not that human nature is the worst, but because of rationally, logically, what human nature will drive us all to do, it will sum up to a state of war that is the worst thing you can think of. So that, of course, is what drives us out of the contract. We're all afraid of being killed and having our stuff taken, and we want to escape war. How do we do that? We have a contract. And the nature of that contract has to do with what Hobbes thinks can control these things and can end this state of war. And what does it do, right? And this is, again, one of those things where is Hobbes a villain? Well, what he wants is security and peace. What he wants is prosperity, poetry, maybe even, beyond poetry and culture and that kind of stuff, maybe love, maybe friendship. How can I make a connection to you if I'm afraid when I see you out, we're walking along across campus, and I'm afraid that you are going to, pull out a baseball bat and whack me and take my laptop. We're not going to be able to sit down and have a conversation, have a nice lunch, and talk about poetry or the latest reality TV show that we all watched. You can't build anything. You can't have any prosperity. You can't have any progress if you can't get past that basic level of trust, if you have constant fear, justified fear, with everyone that you meet, right? So there may be higher goods. There's this basic level of peace and security that Hobbes wants, but he thinks that we can also live much better lives once we have that basic peace and security. Now, because peace and security, right, that this is the one rational thing we all want at all costs, it means that the only time you're going to leave the contract is if you don't have that security, right? So if your life is threatened, then the contract is over. If the government, if the sovereign can't protect you anymore, like say some other government comes and invades and conquers the army, well, the king, the government, whatever, isn't protecting me anymore. I have no longer, the contract is broken. Your end of the deal wasn't kept. I'm free to do whatever I want. But if that's not the case, then Hobbes basically says any government's better than no government. Any government that can keep you alive is better than no government. So it's irrational to ever rebel against a government that's keeping you safe. Right? And so that's this very low bar for what makes a legitimate government. Locke, on the other hand, thinks that people are self-interested and acquisitive, right? They want stuff. But they're industrious and they're cooperative, right? I'm not out to steal your stuff. In fact, I'm governed by a rational understanding of the laws of nature. That stuff that Glaucon was talking about, I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone. Locke thinks that's actually baked into the way our minds work. Now, what role does God play in this? That's an interesting question that we'll get to in Locke. Do you understand that that's the way that people should naturally behave unless you believe in his higher power? Yeah, that's an interesting one. But Locke thinks that in the state of nature, we all kind of understand, don't thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. That kind of stuff is just part of who we are. And so we cooperate and we get along, but it's suboptimal. It's not as good as it could be if we had society and government organizing our behavior. And there are a few reasons for that. And so what do we get by joining the social contract? It's not like it saves our lives, because in general we're not out killing each other, we're not fighting, we're not stealing. What it gets us is better, objective, more empowered enforcement. It secures the laws, our rights under the laws of nature. It doesn't create them. It makes them better. It makes them more useful. It makes them more secure. It prevents conflicts from misunderstandings of, I look at this deal that we're making and I favor myself because I'm self-interested and I'm acquisitive. I want to win the deal. And so I think what's fair is different from what you think is fair. We're both striving for fairness, but unless we have some objective power that says, yeah, that's fair, we might come into some conflict and it might make our dealings less than fully productive. And also, and this is something that we are going to investigate quite a bit with Locke, cash money. That's what we need. We don't have, the biggest inefficiency that we don't have is we don't have a standardized means of conducting commerce. And Locke finds that highly limiting in our ability to develop the land and develop the resources of the earth and to trade and to engage in commerce. And this is a very, make some money. You need a government. You need a common authority in order to get big business going. So, right, what do we get? We get some more efficiency in terms of our rights. We get a currency, and we get more productivity because of those two things. I can make deals with you because I know they're going to be enforced by the courts, and I can bank all of my productivity. Right? Locke will say, what's the point of harvesting 1 million apples if they're all just going to go bad? But if I can sell them for cash and keep that cash, then suddenly the whole world changes because I can be as productive as possible and bank that value, right? So that's what you get out of government for Locke. But because all you're getting is sort of, a more efficient, more effective, more productive version of what you have without a government, you're never going to give up your natural rights, your rights to life, liberty, and property in order to be part of a government. And any government that takes those things from you is illegitimate and must be overthrown. Now, we'll get into how we establish that, but you can probably already see that Locke, all of this, seems very familiar to people who are steeped in American political thought and the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution. All of that is very Lockean. And so we'll want to pay special attention to that. But a lot of political theorists would tell you that Hobbes all holds together in a very interesting, sort of simple way that in some ways is more persuasive than the moving parts of Locke, which have some, particularly involving our understanding of the laws of nature under God, what role God plays in that. Is a little bit of not sure that this all holds together quite as purely as Hobbes, but at the same time, Hobbes tells us we want an absolute monarchy, and Locke tells us we want a democracy where all citizens are guaranteed basic human rights. Yeah, right. That's quite interesting. Now, Rousseau is typically the most difficult to understand, and where Hobbes and Locke seem like they are sort of flip sides of a coin, Rousseau is a little bit different. And in the state of nature for Rousseau, he thinks that we're all independent. We're social, and yet again, we're kind of isolated. We're not building society naturally. We're just like, hey, how's it going? I'm going to walk over here and pick some apples, and I got no interest in you. You got no interest in me, and we're completely free in that sense to choose to do whatever we want. He believes that we are malleable, that being in society changes our character and in more interesting ways, like the ancients thought. And he believes that we're less rational and more emotional creatures. We're rational, but we are also heavily emotional. We feel certain things. And one of the things we feel is we feel bad when we see other people get hurt. So I'm interested in myself more than you, but I also don't like to see you get hurt. And whereas Locke says that's a rational idea that comes from the natural laws that our understanding of God gives us, Rousseau's just like, no, it's just how people feel. Like, I don't like, if I see a tiger rip apart somebody who's walking through the jungle, like, I feel bad. Like, oh man, like, I wish that didn't happen. If I could at low cost, like, keep that from happening, if I see somebody starving, if I see somebody who needs assistance, I'm happy to give it. Not at the sake of, I'm not going to sacrifice my life for just anyone who I see coming around. But in general, we're kind of noble, nice people in the state of nature who are driven internally to be kind and leave everyone alone, offer help when we need to. So for Rousseau, what drives us out of the state of nature? It's not something that we do voluntarily in order to get to a better position, because things were pretty good in the state of nature for Rousseau, whereas they were less than ideal but pretty good for Locke, and they were terrible for Hobbes. But they're pretty much the best for Rousseau. Like, this is great. Well, what happens is very interesting. Rousseau says, well, we're solitary, we're peaceful, we're free. This is the best, but you get more and more people, get more and more competition for resources. People start impinging upon your space. You can't avoid them. And slowly society starts to dominate all the decisions you can make, where you can move, what you can do, where you can find food. And pretty soon you're enmeshed in sort of this social power structure where all of your decisions, what you can do with your life, are determined by the choices of other people. You've lost your freedom, and it sucks, right? Society for Rousseau, in this sort of uncoordinated sense, makes us all very unfree. And we'll have to drill into that more. It can be difficult to understand where Rousseau is coming from. But essentially, he says, we're all constrained. You think about like having to get a job, having to pay your mortgage, having to do all these things, which, hey, if I really were free, I would go and, live my life in some different way. So what do we do? Why do we contract? Is because we're trying to get freedom back. And Rousseau will tell us that we've lost individual freedom, but we can find social freedom. And we can do it by having equality and by building a community where all of our interests are identical. Our individual interests become the community's interests. And in that kind of situation, kind of like Plato's Republic, suddenly all of my choices are the choices that are good for the community. Everything that's good for me, it's what's good for the community. We can create what the ancients thought was natural through a social contract, is sort of Rousseau's idea. And so there's a stronger connection back to the ancients and this sort of what we would call republican thought, as opposed to Locke and the liberal tradition. We tend to associate Rousseau with the republican tradition, that community is important. We may be creating that community through individual choices, but the creation of that ideal community is the only way we can truly ever be free again for Rousseau. And it makes him and Locke, in their own ways, much more interested in revolution against bad governments that are doing, that are taking away your freedom, and much more insistent on trying to establish not simply any government that can be stable and secure, but a government that makes us free. Or enhances our freedom for Locke. And so now the general will is a concept we'll have to discuss, but basically when we're not all in it together and different factions, different groups have different interests, then government and society just degenerates to some people forcing their will and their power over other people, and that's that's the end of the community, and that's the end of this project of communal social freedom. So yeah, I mean, Rousseau feels a little bit different there, but still, these same basic commitments and the contrast between the three will I think will help us understand each one individually and sort of what modern political thought is all about. And again, looking at these questions is a good way when you read each one of them to figure out what they're doing. What do they think is people are like? What do they think's wrong with the world? How do they think that we fix it through government, through a social contract? All right, folks. Talk to you later.